Yeah, I guess to dive in right away, as the introduction point, I'm a multidisciplinary artist. I was born in Colombia, and I have ever since moved to a lot of countries and just worked on a diversity of projects in lots of places. And the project and the ideas that I'm going to discuss with you today are the result of maybe the last 8-10 years of work that brought me back home to Colombia after many years of being in a bit lost in the world. So so the title of today's talk is Iridescent Forest, and it's framing this research project that concluded in December of last year. And I want to acknowledge my research team, which is Yvonne Volkert, Julia Mensch, and Russ Smith. It was a research project funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, which, as throughout the talk, you are going to maybe see and understand a lot of difficulties of carrying this type of project. But one of them is a project that was covering various ecoregions in the world. So my contribution to the project focuses on the Andean Amazon region. So to kind of refer to this, I work closely in the Putumayo region of Colombia, as well as in Peru, in this very special point where the Andes meet the Amazon. So it's the opening of this vital corridor when you go in about 150 kilometers from 3,000 plus meters above sea level all the way to 300 meters above sea level. So it's an incredibly diverse region where plants, animals travel through incredible landscapes that change so quickly. So the Putumayo River also rises near the city of Pasto, which would be at the top of the mountain range in the Andes, the Colombian Andes, and traverses a vast region which forms one of the least known areas of Earth's surface. It's really I think it's one of the most biodiverse regions of Colombia, and still to this day there are many plants species that that people are finding. So just also give you a little bit of context, this river is nearly 1,000 miles long, following through territory which is being claimed by both Peru, Colombia, and enters the mainstream of the Amazon basin, the Amazon River in Brazil. So it's important to mention the river because this is kind of one of the conducting sort of red threads or lines of inquiry that I follow. So the hydrology of this river has been important to me for a number of years, but there is something else that I find quite important in this territory, which is this altitudinal relationships, because you're not only experiencing a landscape, but you're experiencing a landscape that stretches along a vertical axis. So to think of these relationships in this verticality means also to consider what happens deep underground, what happens above the airspace of this region. And this is an incredibly complex territory. So in late 2017, I embarked on a practice-based research project that looks at the contested territorial models where the state, extractive industries, environmentalists, and indigenous nations compete for control across layers of occupation. So from the underground to the airspace, as I mentioned, across this entangled territory. The geometries, inhabitants, and ecosystemic relationships of these territories go well beyond the limits of the visible and the measurable. And this is quite important to say because the context of this research is the years, things are happening and changing so quickly, but the year 2017 was around the time where we had a change of government in Colombia, and the discussion of whether to keep using, for example, glyphosate for aerial dispersion to combat illicit or illegal coca farming was very much on the table. Colombia, Argentina, one of the few places where aerial fumigation with glyphosate is still used, is it's been in my mind for quite a number of years because the effects one of the effects of this chemical, glyphosate, is defoliation. So it's an attack not on necessarily coca plants, but on the entire vegetal communities that live in this landscape. So not to go so much into detail, but the years where I started the research is where the debate was really kind of tense. But it's also whether the debate whether removing this practice or not, and is very much influenced by the US government, the US war on drugs. So it's nice that we are in this building with this complex history, because we have to remember that these practices of ecological violence have been one of the very strong weapons of this of the US government. So for centuries, this Andean Amazon region in the south of Colombia has witnessed many forms of ecological and epistemic violence. Indigenous communities have been trapped in between a multi-layered conflict that have killed thousands and suppressed entire cultures. For me, it's important to say we're talking about like ecological violence, but also ecocide and ethnocide. So from the colonial expeditions in search of El Dorado led by Hernán Pérez de Quesada in 1543, all the way to the present day war on drugs and territorial disputes over mining and oil drilling licenses, these have been constant sites of struggle and erasure of ancestral territorial practices. So I find it important to mention this because it's kind of my way to entering this research, and I guess what with Gabriel we spoke about, kind of giving a full context of how I became interested in these issues. So these are the very same places where El Dorado was supposed to be hidden at some point. But what is incredibly important is to mention that the research is a collection of walks. I started working in this project accompanied by a lot of land defenders, indigenous leaders, male and female, spiritual and governance figures from a number of indigenous nations that live in these territories. So the points where you see highlighted these places where I was working, and along those places one could easily trace the story or the quest for El Dorado, which is still happening. There's a lot of gold hidden on these mountains. There is a lot of resources. So this is kind of the overall framework. This is just an image of a topographic view. You see the number of rivers going through. You see this important lake here in your right-hand side. So I'm going to try to skim a little bit the beginnings of this project to focus on the later part, but something important to mention is that throughout the project, in this first phase of this project I titled Cartographies of the Unseen, which was something I did during my PhD years. One of the intentions was to train indigenous creators, and we formed the first Pan-Amazon Media Collective. We call it for biocultural peace building. So gathering indigenous leaders from across nations in this region was quite an important step to work with them, to render visible these various ways of relating to these territories. I'm trying to stress the fact that when you think about these altitudinal relationships that happen in the region, the Amazon region, you're not only talking about what's measurable, what's seen, but you also have to talk about these complicated territorial logics where the Colombian state keeps shrinking and trying to set a clear line of when the Amazon starts and what should be protected and what not. But also between indigenous nations, there have been a lot of divisions, there have been a lot of tensions that basically cause that or make that there is a need for intercultural, interepistemic exchanges. So along with this media collective, we produce a number of films, walks. So what you see is various productions, and it was an intense process of about 4 years trying to document this intangible territorial aesthetics, all the way from how how do they relate to sites, how is mapping performed, to what are the special features and the special memories of these territories. So its mission is to support the self-governance, cultural preservation, and communication across indigenous territories and beyond through film, radio, and multimedia productions. So, for example, I'm just going to show a clip of one of the films we produced. It's a fragment. It's called Ajenan. The film is Ajenan, Water Territories. It's a very short clip. So in this film, what you see is we were trying to replant gold, a notch of gold, into a sacred landscape that has been in dispute. It's a paramo, so it's a very high altitude wetland. And the idea was to explore the idea of giving back agency to the territory, also to kind of put back something that has been extracted for so long. We went back to a landscape that historically is the place where two competing Spanish armies fought against each other when they were approaching the same place in search for El Dorado. And it's a landscape that, as you see, is quite important because these plants, they're called frailejones or big monks, they grow only 2 centimeters a year. So this wetland is basically a sponge. It's a place where the clouds are feeding the soil with humidity and where rivers are being born. So this is one of the headwaters of the Putumayo River, which later flows all the way to the Amazon. So this idea of planting something back and kind of relating to the landscape, pretty much in a way of giving it agency and asking permission was very important. So this is one of the thoughts I'd like you to keep tonight, which is this: what does it mean to ask permission to a non-human entity, like a plant, like a landscape? What are the protocols? How does it look? Asking permission to, first, why do we have to do it? And second, how do we process this sort of sense of permission asking? So just to show you kind of a clip, we did a number of exhibitions, and there is a lot of films that are on tour and etc. But I guess regarding methods and the way I approach this project is sometimes thinking of my positionality in it. So I like to show this slide quite a lot. It's by Susan Lacey. It's just like a concept that I find useful to think about where is the artist positioned in terms of doing research is experiencing something. We are embedded. I am embedded. My body's present. I am perceiving, sensing, and maybe what is my agency as well. So not only asking permission to a landscape, but it's like what am I doing in that place? So I move in this spectrum. Sometimes it's more operational and activist, if you might say, like forming an indigenous collective, funding them, doing what is possible to find equipment and fundraise and so on, all the way to experiencing. So there are things that I can only here relate as an anecdote, an experience. So somewhere in this spectrum is where artistic research is placed for me. So with this idea of permission asking, so I want to, for a moment, acknowledge your presence, but also the presence of the plants in the room. So for those of you who had a bit of the tea, I wanted to share this tea because it's an important tea for me in what I'm going to share in the next 10 minutes. Among the plants I've been working with, I work with Muña, which is Andean mint, and it's one of the many plants that has incredibly gentle, powerful effects on the human body. So it helps for relaxation. It helps for distressing our lungs. It's like it helps us to breathe. And as you know, the tea is really mild, but the point is that you smell it. The point is that you open your sensorium and think about what is the chemistry that this plant is sharing with us. What are these, these ways of bringing cosmic life into this room. So I like to really think about this cosmic energy, for example, solar energy that is brought into the biosphere, into the body. Because with this idea of asking permission to the plants, I'm also thinking, what do plants, how do they express themselves? How do they embody the multiple relationships that they're exposed to in the world? So with that, I'm interested in also sharing a little bit of the work that came in the later years, which has to do with becoming a lot more present in the discussion of ethnobotany and traditional practices, healing practices. In the previous project, I was always kind of tiptoeing around, shamanism and questions of indigenous medicine. But in this project, so it was a plants intelligence project, I was a lot more relaxed to face it and to think about these other knowledges and how do we engage with these knowledges. So part of the research still kept me in the Colombian Putumayo, but also brought me to the Peruvian foothills, Madre de Dios. But first I'm going to talk about another plant that I encountered in this part of the research. So I want to invoke for a moment the Solanaceae genus, which is the idea of, it's a sun and a type of comforting, soothing plant, which you might actually see a lot, and is known as Brugmansia. In Latin America, is known as borrachero, floripondio. In English, it's known as angel's trumpet, and I'm sure it's somewhere around The Hague and the city, or like you probably have seen it a lot in gardens, because it's one of those trophies of colonization. It's a plant that is so beautiful and is so inviting because of its smell, but at the same time, it has this twisted history and this strange presence. It's a plant that is incredibly toxic. So claims of poisoning from breathing near the plant appear to be rather extravagant, but they happen. Many people claim that they have sickness, it's a disorienting plant. So this is something that I am often hearing, that it's a powerful smell that attracts you, but at the same time repels you if you spend too much time with it. It's a plant that you can see in indigenous homes, in front of indigenous homes in the Colombian Putumayo region. And just a side note, many people imagine that it's a jungle, it's a pristine jungle. No, it's a town with like brick and mortar houses. So the indigenous gardens sometimes have been kind of reduced to just being like a little patch in front of the house. But what is nice is that this plant has some connotations of being a guardian plant. It's a plant that you invite into the room, you invite into your home to guard you. The more you care for it, it cares for you. But at the same time, it's a plant that can deter the presence of those who come with ill intentions to harm you. So it's a type of protective plant. So in that sense, there are many types of varieties of this plant, and there's especially one in the Colombian Putumayo that is known as Borrachero culebra. It used to be known as the mutant sleep plant. It was first identified in 1942 by Richard Evans Schultes, who encountered this rare variety of Brugmansia with narrow leaves, and its toxical effects are way, way more intense than other plants. So what's important here to mention is that the contact with the plant is something that happens. There is a rich history of ethnomedicinal uses of this plant. But to me, it's interesting to think that it's such a toxic plant that in urban uses is either ornamental, but also many people in modern days, many European cities, drink it for hallucinogenic purposes and often have terribly bad trips. Don't do this at home. Don't take this plant. Do not put it in teas. Do not. But it's also associated with a type of raping substance called burundanga. They know it I think in Spain and Colombia. I don't know how they might call it in Mexico. But it's a drug that is given to a person in order to take advantage of them, because it's a type of drug that suppresses our willpower, it distorts our cognitive functions, and it, the type of drug that kind of makes you a little bit subdued to another person's request. So you hand your wallet, you give the pin of your credit or of your bank card, or you give the keys of your house to someone who wants to take advantage of you. So it's a plant that has this power of like really disarticulating our cognition. And I became interested in it because, again, as you see this, many shamans use this plant regularly. So if there was such a thing as a pyramid of important, powerful healing plants, this would be really at the top. It's a very, very complex plant that is in indigenous tradition is used for only special cases. But I like to think about it when I read this quote. A shaman can transform into an animal who is also a person. So for shamans, to know is to personify, to take the point of view of that which is to be known. To learn something, you become what you want to learn from. So in this idea of like transforming into, I started really approaching the plant for what it is. So in terms of this scope of research, I was very much into coming in close contact with the plant. So one of the simple ways is to sleep with it. So you put the plant under your pillow and then you just let it accompany you in your dreams. So thinking about the power of this chemistry, I also want to think about like the quote, yet all hypotheses of the origin of plant-based drugs consider that the main alkaloids, caffeine, nicotine, and so on, this plant has scopolamine, are neurotoxins that were developed to punish and deter herbivores. However, if we accept the idea that the neuroactive molecules produced by plants are not mere deterrent, but are rather tool with which to attract animals and manipulate their behavior, the paradox is easily resolved by placing the plant-animal interaction in a very different ecological context. So again, I'm interested in this plant because it's a plant that has become a cultigen. So it's not a plant that grows on its own anymore. It needs us. It needs the help of a carer to plant it, to grow it, to water it. There are no known species who eat or propagate the seeds of this plant because they're so toxic. So it's a plant that is appealing to us because of its beauty, because of its amazing colors, its like attractive smell. But if we come too close to it, we get poisoned. Just holding the seeds is incredibly dangerous because it has scopolamine, which is naturally found in different plants of the Solanaceae family, but this is a muscarinic. Scopolamine is a muscarinic antagonist, structurally similar to the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, and acts by blocking the muscarinic acetylcholine receptors, and is thus classified as an anticholinergic plant, as an anticholinergic agent which produces cognitive deficits in humans, rats, monkeys, and so on. So I'm just reading a little bit of what it does. So anyway, what I'm interested in is this sort of, it's a plant that kind of opens this twofold interpretation, because on the one hand has a shamanic, a sacred use, but on the other one has this strange use in urban context, which is the one I just shared. So in English, the drug is called an evil's breath, burundanga, which is this drug that I refer to. But I mean, it's also in the family of these incredibly powerful plants that, I mean, whatever you take there, potatoes, they're the drivers of culture. So what kind of culture is it driving? So with it, I embarked on a project that it was a film project working with my collaborator, Ajenan Kinchoaho-Hibioi, who was the actor and filmmaker, camera person of the previous film as well. It kind of talking about a different story of this plant, and this story is about a traveler who so somehow, because of the encounter with this plant, is catapulted, is sent inexplicably to European landscape all the way from the Colombian Amazon. So I wanted to think about this idea of what if plants could affect the course history, and to imagine this reversal journey of an indigenous land defender who suddenly is lost and is appearing here in Europe, trying to find a way back home, as opposed to what history tells us, which is that the colonial settlers were arriving, as you know, to the Americas to find riches and so on, then come back home and put them here. So this installation is called Tunda, the Quantic Plant and Devil's Breath. I'm just going to show a very simple clip. Well, I can talk about it. So this was one of the outcomes of the project. So, and I have a few minutes now to talk about the second part. But in general, this was an installation presented at the Haus für Medienkunst Oldenburg. There was a component in this installation, which is a smell that, because of its complexity, could not be Brugmansia. But then I worked with other smells and in collaboration with a conservation project in Peru to kind of try to create a smellscape of what surrounds this plant. So what was interesting is that you come into the space to watch this film, and you're getting a piece of history, but also you're smelling a piece of the landscape that surrounds the plant. So just kind of to go forward a little bit. So again, what I said is a plant that is capable of disrupting cognition on the one hand, but also is enhancing this cognitive ability of relating to an illness or healing or coming in contact with nature in different ways, which is the shamanic approach to plant medicine. So in that sense, I want to quote this quote by Paco Calvo: "Cognition, according to Clark Chalmers, included the tools we use to think with: pens and paper, words, processors, calculators, and art materials, and so on." So they describe a self that was not contained and limited, but networked, a composite of neurons and things spanning the inanimate and the animate. So what I want to say is that, to me, it's really interesting when you think about plants as this extension of these cognitive capabilities or these cognitive functions that we as people have. The history of ethnomedicinal practices is way too long, and it's been present in many cultures. There is so in the case of the Amazonian communities, the Kamsha, Inga, Siona, and the other communities I work with, it's interesting to think how they have developed and come to relate to these plants via permission asking, via like a careful use of its chemistry, not just trial and error, but also like putting themselves in a position where the human body and our chemistry is in contact with the substances. So that leads to another part of the work where I also investigated when does this happen. And to me, what was interesting is that a lot of these encounters with plants took place, let's say, at nighttime. Shamanic practices operate at night, and is in this gap between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. that the machines that are depleting the Amazon go silent, and the chants and the shamans practice their medicinal rituals with the patients. Also, is the moment when the metabolism of plants is just at its peak. So it's the moment where the smell, for example, one is guided in the forest not by what one can see, because our eyes just don't work at night, but by the smell. So I was interested in basically going through the forest at night and really looking at how plants are perceived. And I was working with a number of cameras, multispectral cameras, especially, and develop a way to document what is so visible to the human eye, working with a set of filters and UV lights and so on. All to encounter that plants really escape. There are no green. Green is only something that we perceive during the day, and it's very much filtered by the human eye. So many of these, I mean, as you see, so I'm kind of working in in the spectrum that is subvisible to the human eye. So along this peak, the first peak, 400 nanometers, this is kind of where I'm interested in. And to document not just what's subvisible to the human eye, but what is visible to other plants. Because plants have a way of perceiving. Like they perceive light and shadow, they also perceive one another in these ranges of, or these vibrations of subvisible light. So with that, I embarked on a sort of part B of the research, where I was very much interested in what happens during nighttime, what happens in this encounter with plants on their own terms, on their own space, and thinking about what is part of us what is part of this cognition that we identify as so human, but it's also happening within the plant. So I wanted to think about this issue of plant intelligence, not from this computational aspect where we attribute plants the capacity to make decisions and predict, but only on certain variables. But I was interested more in the relational part, the relational component of plant intelligence, which is how do we come to relate to what plants know, and how do we come to relate to what they know about us. Because there is this reciprocity. Plants are being gardened, they're being cultivated. So in that, I began asking myself, so is there a way in which plants mobilize us, mobilize people, even though if they cannot move? I found this idea of movement quite also important, because movement was this way to classify intelligence back in the day. So we were supposed to be more, occupy the upper layers of the intelligent behaviors, because we had this ability to move and plants didn't. But over time, we're discovering that movement is just one of those features. Plants are moving. There are plants that are walking. They're transitioning from one altitude to another, and so on. But more than that, the way that plants also mobilize us, for example, in indigenous practices, is through ingestion, through healing, through nourishment. The way that they transfer cosmic energy and turn into nutritional value that ultimately we are reliant on. So in that sense, I'm going to conclude with a bit of a last bit. This is a picture of a chagra, an indigenous garden. But a lot of these landscapes are heavily disturbed. So this is happening in the Peruvian Amazon, and is in the surroundings of the Manu National Park in the Tambopata Reserve. So this is what you see from an aerial view. And if you were to go down, suddenly you start seeing the effects of gold mining and how much these landscapes have been disturbed. So in the work I've been doing, I'm gonna now tell you something closer to the other spectrum, which is, encountering places where the ecological crisis is coming to the point of really changing the vocation of landscapes that were produced by vegetal agencies. And now what you have is a type of inverted oasis, this lunar-like landscape in the middle of the Amazon. It also mirrors something that happened to me, very personal. This is a picture of my lungs in 2022 after a trip to the landscape. This is what you see from the aerial view. It's like nothing has changed much since 2017, because just literally there is nothing that grows. This is the result of alluvial gold mining. These landscapes are very much affected by mercury poison. The land has been poisoned. So again, in that spectrum of research, I guess I'm going to relate more to the experience part. Because what happens is, ultimately, being in those landscapes, I became infected with the fungus that is quite rare, that is emerging in the Amazon. And it was, as a researcher, it was a quite novel encounter, not only for me, but for the medical team that had to help me, from the Tropical Institute in Basel and a lot of other research institutes. So I became the research subject of that which I was researching. But there was no healing for it. And this story is a bit disturbing because because it was actually going back to the landscape, going back to the indigenous traditions, going back to the Brugmansia, the Munya tea, the one that you're drinking, that started to show some signs of healing. So that led me to think about this exchange with these vegetal capacities that started to bring me close to an encounter with something that I never experienced before, which was this state of being when one comes in close contact with the plant, because none of these healing processes were easy and were reasonable. What happens is that encounter with plants ultimately leads to these weird effects, the non-thinking part of the body, the feeling, the metabolic movement that goes on in your gut. So I wanted to kind of present this sense of like engaging with the vegetal intelligences through the relational aspect to provoke a different type of enlightenment, not the enlightenment that we think historically as the big discovery of reason or discovery of the powers of reason, but the powers of the metabolic effects of our body when reason is pushed out. So by being in close contact with, for example, Brugmansia, in other ways not consumed as tea, I think I put my body in a state of not thinking. My kind of cognitive capabilities were completely altered. So being again the research subject of my own research kind of is an interesting twist of the story, like pretty much showing that this double mirror image of my lungs like being somewhat similar to what one encounters in the landscape, and only knowing that it's through the same plants that are supposed to inhabit that landscape that healing comes is really, for me, powerful. So the healing process was somewhat complicated, and it had to do with that act of breathing. So my lung capacity was decreased by almost 70%, so I was pretty much gasping for air. And the plant that you're drinking was one of those that really helped me to distress my lungs. So again, I want to invoke this sense of plant. This plant's capacity is a way of, we are breathing with the plants, and plants are very much involved in this very important planetary effect of allowing us to breathe. So in that sense, maybe I want to leave with a bit of a provocational idea, which is, I'm not so thinking about intelligence today. We have artificial intelligence, we have like large language models and so on, where the intelligence the type of intelligence that we assume tends to be in the, it's like how fast can we parse through data? How fast can we move in through these vector probabilities? And it's not referring necessarily of this capacity of relations, this capacity of relating between intelligent actors or intelligent beings. So I very much think more than intelligence on the capacity of intelligibility of plants. So intelligibility refers to the potential of something to be understood or made sense of by an intelligent agent. So in that sense, I want to leave you with this thought. I hope this was not of a tour de force through the ideas, but if I can say anything, the arrival point was to very much open my capacity to acknowledge the intelligible capacities of plants more than this computational effect that we think from this side of the world towards plants as these only decision makers when they have very set variables. So with that, I want to conclude with playing a film. So maybe I'm a few minutes over time, but I hope it's okay with the next speakers. So the film is titled Behind the Night, and it was one of the productions that came out from this research project. So yeah, I hope you enjoy it.
Ten cuidado. La selva es buena, sí, pero también es misteriosa. Cada planta tiene su fuerza, su carácter y sus intenciones. Cuando tú buscas algo de ellas, las plantas también buscarán algo de ti. Por eso no puedes entrar a la selva así nomás. Existen muchas plantas que curan, pero algunas se esconden, se protegen. En el Amazonas, el sol se pone justo después de las 6 de la tarde y sale justo antes de las 6 de la mañana. 12 horas de luz, 12 horas de oscuridad. La mitad de la vida de la selva sucede en la noche. Pero la oscuridad no significa silencio ni quietud. La selva brilla, respira, sueña y a veces también nos observa. Durante la noche, las plantas se reorganizan, se mueven sin necesidad de músculos y te hablan sin tener voz. Por eso sobrevivir aquí exige sentir, no solo mirar. Una vez probé la resina de catahua y fumé sus hojas. Esa noche, en un sueño, la planta vino a hablarme. Apareció como un hombre pequeñito y me preguntó, ¿por qué nos buscas? ¿Qué quieres de nosotros? ¿Quieres aprender a ser chamán? Yo le dije que no lo sabía, que tenía curiosidad, pero no veía el camino. Y el espíritu me dijo, para ser chamán no basta con conocer la planta, tienes que convertirte en ella. Dejarla enraizar en tu cuerpo, en tus tripas y en tu espíritu. De esa forma serás lo que conoces y verás luz cuando ya no llega el sol. El chamán ya no ve con la mirada, sino con sus entrañas. Porque aquí, en la selva, los ojos no siempre sirven para ver.
Yo estoy en el bosque, en algún momento miré una planta, digamos, en un lugar estratégico. Yo voy a ese lugar donde miré esa planta y ese día que yo fui a traer, digamos, a buscarla por alguna situación que la necesité, no está esa planta. Pues como da como le digo, se eriza el cuerpo, vaina. Pues si yo esta planta la miré hace 15 días, hace un mes aquí, ¿qué pasa? No está. Se escondió, porque con la intención que yo iba a colectarla para llevarla a una X persona, no es el momento de esa planta sanar a esa persona. Y volví al mes a ese lugar y la planta estaba ahí, tal como la había visto la primera vez. Es un espíritu. No sabemos de quién sea. Entonces puede ser que esa planta que estaba encarnada en alguna animal, en algún momento pues estuvo en este mundo y ya se fue a descansar, pero está ahí encarnada en esa planta.
Los espíritus en la selva son muy poderosos. A quien la selva no conoce, lo confunde y lo desorienta, y cuando lo encuentran, ya no es el mismo. Ya está perdido, o tal vez muy loco. Por eso les digo, de buenas a primeras, no puedes entrar a la selva. Aquí se camina con respeto. Dicen que hay un espíritu que te engaña con sus huellas. Tiene un pie pequeño, como de niño, y otro pie grande, de adulto. Camina como si retrocediera. Por eso lo llaman Chuya Chaki. Chuya, pie chico. Chaki, pie grande. Se molesta fácil, te sigue y te obliga a escuchar cosas que no quieres oír. La selva no es oscura y llena de sombras, es luminosa, pero de una luz que no todos pueden ver. Hay árboles que brillan por dentro. Uno de esos árboles es el almendrillo, solo aparece de noche. Su corteza es azul y brilla cuando no la miras. Es un árbol que de vez en cuando se deja ver, pero no se recuerda. Los biólogos no logran nombrarlo, tal vez se oculta. Es un árbol que rara vez se quiere mostrar, pero si lo hace, es en su propio lenguaje. Entonces yo me pregunto, ¿pueden las plantas mostrarnos el camino del saber incluso en la oscuridad? Seguramente no será con respuestas claras ni con nitidez, sino con paciencia para notar sensaciones, aromas, sabores, y con una forma de sentipensar con el estómago, los pulmones y hasta las venas que a veces parecen raíces que nos recorren, y no solo contemplar ideas con la mente, porque de noche la selva no se apaga. Aprender a percibir en la oscuridad es una urgencia silenciosa, porque solo quien escucha lo invisible puede ser recibido por el bosque. Por eso, cuando entras al monte, debes llevar tabaco. Fumas un cigarro al entrar y otro al salir. Es una forma de pedir permiso, para que los malos espíritus no te molesten y puedas aprender de la selva y ver su luz cuando nada la ilumina. Ya no basta con mirar, hay que rendirse al pulso vegetal y al lenguaje que no se dice, pero que todo lo impregna, y así nos volvemos receptores, testigos de una luz que no se ve, pero que vive detrás de la noche.
Hello? Yes, okay. Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Andong Zheng. I am a visual artist and academic alumni, and recent graduate from the Master Photography and Society program. And thank you, Gabriel, for your invite, and thanks for everyone to being here tonight. Yeah, I would love to briefly give you a brief introduction to my practice, particularly this recent work I've made for the last few years. And I want to use this photograph to start off the introduction of my work tonight. It's titled Lattice of Rhetoric. I think it somehow captures something about the relationship between us as a human being with nature, which shaped much of the human history, and in many, many ways still shapes how we understand nature today. This is a publication called Geographic Distribution of the Pines of the World, published by the United States Department of Agriculture in the 60s. And there's a map inside of this atlas, which shows you the geographies of East Asia. And my work starts from this region. I was born and raised from this region, and this is also being a geopolitically charged region. And here you can see 3 different names of pine species, and you can also see the distributional range of them on the map. And what interests me here is the differences between 2 scales, one being the ecological one, and the other one being the geopolitical one, under the territorial logic of the nation state. And when these 2 kind of scales intersect, interesting things start to appear. So these 3 species, what I'm researching, were named in different historical contexts. First by a German botanist upon his return from expedition in the Far East. And then by a Japanese botanist who stationed in the colonial Taiwan at the time, was carrying out the research for useful plants. And then by a Chinese botanist in the 1930s during Republican era. Decades after these trees being named, given the Latin name, and during the Cold War in the 60s, a Chinese botanist who advocated for a merging act for these 3 different species under one single name, and without giving much of the argument. And in the decades that followed, many botanists challenged his viewpoint until today. So until today, this argument is not yet being settled. It still remains in the limbo. And that's formed the starting point of my research of these three different species. And for the last few years, I've been traveling and going to these native habitats of these trees to photograph them. And I kept wondering along these journeys, what counts as knowledge and what lies between seeing and knowing. So here I'm just going to show you some of the photographs I took along this journey. Yeah. So from the top of the mountain to the coastal shores, I constantly encounter these forms, highly similar forms. And sometimes in the nighttime when I was confronting those landscapes, for moments I perhaps couldn't really figure out where I was located. Moments of disorientation. And yet again, I can always see the humanics intervention, our projections towards nature. Somewhere along this journey, I think the visual strategy of my work start to taking the form, which is comes down to the medium of photography, largely, about the limitations, about the four lines around the frame. And I kept wondering about this limitation and the restrictions. It is essentially the limitation of our scope of sight, our understanding towards something beyond us. So after receiving Gabriel's invitation, I spent quite some time to think about my positionality regarding this body of work and our topic of discussion tonight. And I try to imagine different audiences. I try to imagine the audiences who potentially lived in a region shaped by geopolitical tensions might experience a very different sense of urgency. I imagine a tree grower who is not really familiar with the ecological theory, perhaps, might ask how this shared vision we are discussing today relates to their everyday experiences. Or a botany enthusiast who goes to botanical garden regularly to spend their pastime. And how do I invite for a different kind of conversation? In this sense, I think the question for me here is how a sense of ecological urgency can become tangible across different contexts. So to go back to the very example of one of my show constellation, I think what I'm trying to do here is contrasting two different spatial scales. One is being the ecological one and the other being the geopolitical one. And the question of the limits here, of man-made boundaries, is asked back towards the audience. And at the same time, their attention can shift towards the agency of the plants. I mean, there are two layers. First, there's acknowledgements of the limitations, and thus beyond, I think, being the presence of the tree as a seemingly neutral subject matter, and it can advocate to think beyond and further. And in this regard, I would like to think of my work more as a conditioning process. I think on our way towards a shared ecological imagination, it's also important to acknowledged the uneven terrains. And I think that's some of the modest contribution for works like what I'm trying to do, is trying to contribute our shared imagination towards the future. Thank you. That's what my take for the 5 minutes. Yeah.
Mariana, you want to follow? Is that good? Thank you.
I'll just quickly put a timer for myself, because I tend to lose track of time. Hi, everyone. I'll open. Yes. Yes. Wait, sorry, I didn't realize that it was mirrored. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Hi. My name is Mariana Fernandez Mora, and I am a researcher, artist, and writer, and I'm currently doing a PD, which is a professional doctorate. It's kind of like a PhD, but applied. And I am doing it at the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences, or the Hogeschool van Amsterdam, for those who speak Dutch. And my doctoral research is called Entangled Machines, Decolonial Modes of Encounter with Artificial Intelligence. Now, a little bit about my practice. I'm currently focused on the historical and ongoing entanglements between algorithmic systems, knowledge production, and extractivism. And I am interested in how these technological systems shape bodies, environments, and forms of perception, and in developing strategies of resistance, refusal, and reorientation grounded in anti-colonial, feminist, and ecological thought. Now, what does that look in practice? My research is actually my practice is actually quite diverse, but it usually starts from writing. I use writing not only as a way of researching my own thoughts and theories, but also as an artistic expression. I wrote this book which was my graduation thesis from the Sandberg Institute, titled Dear Machines, in which I wonder what does artificial intelligence is doing to the way we produce knowledge and the way we talk about intelligence as well. Also, as part of my research at the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences, I started this project called Slow AI. And one of the outcomes, or one of the ways in which we share the research, is this publication. It's an annual publication called Restless Grounds. It's a way also to communicate essays, but also to share the practice of the artists that we invite into the research. In Slow AI also, we investigate the concept of the material playground, which is a concept that was described by philosopher Erik Rietveld, who also has a studio practice in Studio Raaf, together with his brother Ronald Rietveld. And they talk about how artistic practices can actually help us investigate technologies otherwise and find their affordances, but also without the need of instrumentalization. And I also host the podcast Restless Grounds, same title as the publication, and I'm working on the second season right now, but you can already listen to the first season in any streaming platform. But I wanted to talk today about my research in my doctorate, in which I look into ideas of embodiment in relation to AI, or to, more broadly, algorithmic technologies, and how they can allow us to understand the technology as a hyper-dispersed body that is fragmented across social, cultural, political, economic, ecological, and affective landscapes. And in this sense, I use the term body not to talk about a biological entity, but more in the sense, in a philosophical sense that is closer to Spinoza, in a way that it's a subject or an object that can be affected and that can have affect and affect others. So in this sense, I look at artificial intelligence as a planetary assemblage. And then referring back to notions of the body, and again, not as a anthropocentric term or just as a biological entity, but think more about a body of water or a body as a territory or a landscape. And in that sense, we can start to understand of AI as something that is actually an assemblage of several other bodies or other assemblages, but that is also dispersed across water, cables, devices, energy, labor, desire, attention, territories, minerals, data. And how this circulates across politics, societies, ecologies, affect, economies, and culture. And in this sense, I introduced this term that I named planetary somatics as a decolonial lens for understanding how these technologies and other computational technologies, through their impacts on Earth, like understanding them through their impact on Earth, and looking at how they register across bodies, territories, and infrastructures. And this looks at, for example, planetary extraction, planetary exhaustion, planetary metabolism, but also planetary mourning as a practice of this metabolism, of how to deal with these registers. And in this context, I look at this term that I actually found through a journal of psychology in the context of hospice care. There's called lullament, so it's a mix of lullaby and lament. And I was really captured by the description of what the lullament actually, how it operates in practice. And what it does is that sustains the spirit, supports psychological structure, and enables resilience during times of vulnerability to the effects of adversity, to aid the transition between life cycles. And to me, this term became really relevant in the course of the initial research as a way to understand also how can we deal and how can we metabolize with this registration, with this exhaustion. And the first case study, and sorry that I'm going so fast, but I'm running out of time, is my first case study is actually looking at the Clarion-Clipperton fracture zone, which is the main zone for deep sea mining or seabed mining, which is currently one of the most contested areas in this blue side of the globe. And basically, if you turn around the globe, you would only see water. And until very recently, it was considered to be kind of a dead zone, which was also a myth, because of course it's full of life. But this myth also contributed to the potential legalization of extraction of these zones. And I'm looking specifically at how this extraction, which is propelled by algorithmic technologies and their demand for energy and minerals to make batteries, but also semiconductors, could affect the ecosystem in this specific area. And also, how could we metabolize it and how we could deal with its register. So in this sense, the lament becomes a planetary somatic practice to lament and mourn extractive legacies related to algorithmic technologies and their increasing energy demand, a way to metabolize the affective layers of extraction. I'll end there.
Thanks a lot, Mariana. Maybe Rock, we have the third presentation, and then we have time to join together and unfold the dialogue.
Well, thank you everyone for coming here. Thank you so much, Gabriel, for the invitation. My name is Roc Monturiol, and I'm currently doing a master in sonology in the Royal. Sorry, one second. In the Conservatory of The Hague, and yeah. It's going to be quite a compact presentation, so if you don't mind, I'm going to be reading here. I hope this is okay. Okay, so plants have been accompanying me and my sonic practice for quite some time already in very significant ways, and I am currently doing a master's in sonology, and in my project, the vegetal is at the core of it. Even though plants have been often considered quiet organisms that are actually unresponsive to sounds, they are actually very meaningfully involved in sonic and audible worlds. We know, for instance, that plants produce sounds when they are water stressed. Aquatic plants produce sounds through photosynthetic processes. A number of animal species utilize plant tissues or plant structures for communication. We also know through recent findings in the field of plant bioacoustics that plants are able to discriminate the sounds of moving water and that they respond chemically to leaf vibrations caused by insects. So ever since I became aware of the sonorous domains of plants, I've been listening to their sounds, to the sounds they make, and to the sounds taking place in the sites where they grow. So for that, I've had to experiment a lot with different techniques of field recording, utilizing different sorts of microphones, sometimes crafting or modifying my own. The sounds of plants are sometimes too quiet, sometimes outside of our frequency range. So to hear them, you really need to get beyond the sort of traditional approaches to field recording, where the human ear is taken as the model for listening. You know? So where there's this sort of mimesis of our ears. So you really need to get beyond that. With my research, I'm trying to approach a practice of listening that situates plants at its core, where field recording, performance, performativity, it's something I'm very much interested in. So recording, performance, writing, these are formats these are ways for me to cultivate a sort of dialogue with the vegetal. So a dialogue with them and their habitats, engaging the matters and meanings, we could say, through which they construct worlds, or participate in processes of worlding, of making worlds together with other symbiotic partners. Worlding here is meant to be the sort of intertwined process of cohabitation that transforms them and their environments altogether. So I'm trying to explore sonically this sort of symbiotic performance of place, we would say, that constantly builds and rebuilds the livable worlds that we actually share with them. So within these sonic worldings, that I'm mentioning, within these sonic worldings, I'm trying to reformulate, or I'm trying to expand on questions that others have posed under different contexts and under different moments in history. So different situated conditions for knowledge. And in the sort of, these have been developed when we look at the canonical listening modes literature, and still often in contemporary listening methodologies, there are certain understandings of agency, of intentionality, of attentionality that are perhaps not so useful, no, when we are trying to engage in the sonorous and oral domains of plants. So with plants, I'm trying to develop a framework for listening where to get beyond subject-object binaries. So, and here to be clear, even though I'm saying that, well, I'm trying to listen to and with plants to the places where they grow, I'm not referring them as objects of perception, of mere, let's say, sound sources. I'm also not referring to them as listening subjects, no? So at least not in the way these categories are framed in the listening modes literature. What I'm trying to do with plants is to propose a practice of listening that entangles, no, that assembles objects and subjects all together in recurrent or in circular relationalities. And something that is also important for me, to go from this idea of a listening subject to something we could call a constellation of listening, or something like this. In this dialogue I'm trying to have with plants, I'm not so much interested in extending a sort of sonic thinking onto them to understand the dynamics of vegetal existence, and also to sort of impose sonic discourse onto plants. But for me, this is rather a way to, let's say, listen to listening itself, no? So with them, in order to unsettle, to reconfigure our listening practices. So I found out that when I actually extended this question of listening to plants, listening itself, no, the very idea and practice of it, sort of came back reformulated in a very different way. So for me to think and practice listening with plants, it doesn't speak so much of a relation between a learning subject, between that could be me, and a prefigured object of study, but it's much more about a dialogue where what it is to be learned is actually always in the making. And well, that's my part here, and I hope we can maybe extend a little bit more on these threads in the discussion. So,
thank you, Rob. So, I mean, the invitation was quite open to start a dialogue. I think there's been a lot of input. So I'm curious if any of you wants to start immediately with a comment or exchange among you, or if not, I will start, and I'm leaving it open. No? You want me to start? Okay. Well, I mean, thanks all of you for all the presentations. I think there's a lot of rich input. So it's not so easy to decide where to start exactly, but I guess I would like to kind of go back to Felipe and his presentation and see how that also is kind of flowing through several of the inputs that came later, focusing on this kind of reconsidering of the production of intelligibility that you were talking about, Felipe, because I guess that was a central point there in which how you were trying to reconsider intelligence on the one hand by questioning what agency is assumed. So when we think about intelligence, are we immediately attributing an agency to a subject which we usually consider human? But I guess that in traversing a lot of what you spoke about, your intention was to, first of all, push that forward to the realm of the vegetal. And one fundamental question that arises here is, that I think you were bringing up, is how intelligibility is produced in these relations with the vegetal without the starting agency. So in a way, I want to start a question to you, Felipe, maybe to elaborate on this, but I think this has already appeared in also the three of you somehow as a question in how we need to, or you are inviting to readjust our notions, our key notion of intelligibility to understand how we think intelligence. So curious.
Yeah, thanks for the question, and thanks so much for your presentations, because definitely there is a lot, and thank you for your patience and attention, because there was a lot to digest. So, I mean, I think we're in a moment where the term intelligence is used and exhausted somehow. So I think it starts with definitions. What do we refer to as intelligent, and why, for example, are we attributing, I suppose, intelligence to, machinic intelligence? When ultimately, what it does is performing. Is it still on? Hello. It does is performing a kind of a computational process, which is ultimately about, decision making, but not in a way that it's about articulating variables. But it's about, choosing right or wrong. So the way that, for example, this idea of intelligibility to me comes is to start thinking about intelligence in the space in between these agencies. So human intelligence as an extension of, or in complement or in relation to the knowing of plants. Something I was wanted to stress, is like let's think about nicotine and tobacco. What does this plant know about the world, about us, in order to evolve in that way to create such a molecule that matches so perfectly with our neurotransmitters receptors? Is this intelligence or not? But again, it's about definitions, because we I guess, always risk to turn this into an anthropocentric view. So that's why I'm thinking not only in the sort of brainy, mental, head-heavy intelligence, but how about this metabolic process? So, for example, sharing the tea with you today, invites the question of, are you thinking today alone? Or are you thinking with this plant? Because its chemistry is already causing something in your state of being, in your state of attention, in your capacities for listening. So again, to me, this intelligibility happens in this space in between.
I'm curious if maybe from there we can go a bit, and then I started with Felipe, but immediately I'm curious about the input from all of you into something I was bringing before the session today, which is about methods. So also, because if you can elaborate, everything that you shared, you talked about, and now you're bringing again this knowledge of the plants, and a lot of the descriptions you made today had to do with becoming aware of all this agency that plants have in shaping our world, that usually in our kind of anthropocentric view, this is of a kind of master-slave relationship with plants, all that is erased. But in accessing what you are talking about now, what methods are you developing in a way? Or what, I know it's a difficult question, but I'm curious, even if it's difficult or it's challenging, but I think it's somehow at the core of what we are sharing, we're all trying to do in a way. So I'm curious about all your input. I mean, how is it possible to unfold, to uncover this other process of intelligibility through a particular research process, or maybe a particular artistic research process?
It's not an easy question, but it's also, it's easy to anticipate an answer, which is, I think methods are this tricky term that one can throw and actually misuse, because, methodologies we kind of all know is a way to go forward with something, right? It's a way to process, do something about something else. So my question sometimes is like, how do I go about finding X? And ultimately, is the work a vehicle to help me find that out? So for example, the methodologies I used, I'm very present, and as you saw in my presentation, you go to the field with one idea and you come out and this idea has changed because your body has been exposed to the field. So in that sense, is my body a vehicle? Can my body be a methodological tool? So of course you start thinking, and for example, I'm very fond of these ideas of sensorial ethnography. I'm very fond of these ideas of deep listening, and just like to invite the sensorium as a portal to investigate the world, life worlds, or like the experience of others. But I'm also spending, for example, a lot of time in the chagras, in the indigenous gardens, and observing that there becomes this mutuality that you see in ecosystemic relationships between the farmer, the plant, because there is an aspect of mutual care. So is that relationship a method? Is that way of, you care for the plant that energizes you, so you have the energy to put that, to care for the garden? So in that sense, can that be a vehicle to finding something out? So so for example, I'm also interested in the role of filmmaking in the sense of, is the work a vehicle to find something out? So what you saw today is something I'm developing for a number of years, which is this, it's a proposition to think about like a filmic cartography to provide you a sense of place, a sense of inhabiting and relating to a distant site through a bunch of images and sound compositions. Can it do it? I'm still not sure if it's effective or not, but this is something I'm interested in, like the aesthetic experience is a way to inhabit in a place that is so far away. That's one, but the second is like, it changes when you're drinking something, you're smelling something, and you're watching it. So in that sense, I think, as I said, like methods, there's so many options to go about. And for example, in your works, I'm also very, very intrigued by the positionality you take in terms of methods, because in artistic research, I am also cautious because I find like the artistic research is caught a little bit into, does it have some methodological processes that are clearly scripted, but you see artists doing incredible work, finding incredible ways to uncover or gather or harvest ideas and knowledge, but it's totally, the approaches are very unique and very hard to replicate. So in that sense, I like sometimes to think about like the way that artistic and research competences, being able to read, to perceive, to sense, is maybe that talking about instead of methods.
Thank you. That's, I think I'm just going to continue on. So I think I touched upon a little bit during my presentation regarding the methodology or my general positionality regarding my research. I feel like to a large extent, I've been constantly working with limits. It stems from the very medium I'm working with. Lens-based media, by nature, it has 4 lines, has a photographic frame, being filmmaking or photography. And it's such a fragile thing that links a small object and a registration in a time space. And so much is also being applied on this seemingly futile attempt to categorize and understanding nature. So I feel like also, even though I drew the kind of diagram in a linear fashion, but it just doesn't really work that way in my imagination, but it somehow gives you an idea about the conditioning process I'm trying to talking about. It's about acknowledging this uneven terrains from different part of the world and different social context when approaching what we're trying to achieve, this shared vision of vegetal intelligence. I mean, me personally, I've been living and working across different contexts and geographies, and oftentimes I kept pressing on this question towards myself, is that to what extent is this work relatable and bringing out the sense of urgency towards my audience who is actually here. And I feel like in my case, particularly, to give you a more concrete example, like because of the very tree I'm talking about, it become somewhat polysemantics in a very location of in East Asia, within the region where the geopolitical conflicts and tensions are high. And these elements, the tree, seemingly a seemingly neutral subject matter, can become starting point to foster some kind of conversations around those beings, and through a way of the very limitation of the medium itself, which is photography. It's eventually a small photographs, and particularly, like if you cannot really detect the geographical feature or the background from the image, remotely it's become inscrutable. And so the ambiguity is being thrown back to the audience themselves. And in a way, what I'm actually trying to understand, what I actually trying to perceive or see, what I'm trying to get from these images, and what does that mean, like from that point of seeing something as knowing something, whereas goes to a completely different social context where it's not really affected by this geopolitical tension, and the work can take on a different layer of meaning. I'm trying to say is that by acknowledging these differences in context, and especially as an artist who work across different contexts, I think there's a sense of solidarity I want to bring out on the table, and in order to achieve to where we want to go. And this is by no means to create a hierarchy, to kind of prepare to describe our effort into different stages. But I feel like, yes, to be able to detect and accustom to the local context is crucial and in my work. So that's actually one of the things I'm trying to figure out as a methodology as an artist. So.
Well, maybe I can say a few things. If I think about methodology, in my case, I find myself like constantly repurposing maybe question or like methods, strategies from other fields of study, and I find, for instance, very useful fields like plant bioacoustics, that really took seriously the question of, hey, plants might be doing sounds, and actually they do in many different ways. To this, there's actually in the contemporary times, there's also like an approach to ecoacoustics in which like you are sort of like monitoring the environment to mostly get, for instance, like, well, it's kind of important to get like indices of species and so on. So these are approaches that kind of inform what I do, but at the same time, I feel like we perhaps are not formulating exactly the same questions, no? In a sense, like the way they pay attention to plants is perhaps not the same that I do. For instance, in ecoacoustic settings, there's like this common practice where all the recordings that are affected by rain are automatically discarded. No? And for me, like me as, I don't know, as a sound artist, or the question is, well, the sounds of the rain are actually the noise or are the signal, no? And I think it's a question that I'm constantly making. Also, mostly it's just about that, about like how to frame the way I pay attention to plants, very much informed by like all other fields of knowledge, but also like being able to, I guess, get beyond these sort of frameworks, or like combining others that might seemingly maybe they don't connect so much, but like making use of them and trying to attend to them in different ways.
Maybe shall I ask, because I want to ask you, Mariana, and maybe going back, maybe on the last one, because I would like to open up also to the audience. I guess there's questions and input come from there, but going back a little bit to this production of intelligibility and the intelligibility and the initiative that Felipe was bringing already at the beginning to how to get at these other understandings of engagement with the vegetal that really, in very basic elementary ways, contradict, as again, what I was saying probably before, this kind of master-slave paradigm that we usually rely on. And Mariana, you talked about on your questions about how to develop other ways to rethinking intelligence, and you talked also about body and landscape, which I thought in a way resonated also with questions were coming also before, not only when Felipe all the time talking about the different landscapes and how we understand landscape, but also bodies, and you talked about bodies of water, and in a way, when you mentioned that, I was curious if there was a kind of clear boundary between what is a body and what is a landscape. Are those different conceptual tools that you use to think about the relation between these two instances? Curious if that helps maybe open up also about your approach to these broader questions.
Thank you for linking the questions. I was thinking about also how to respond, since the subject is very much grounded in the plant world. And although I look at landscapes and the planetary, my understanding or my literacy in the exact plant worlds or plant ecosystems is not, that's not where my expertise lies. But perhaps for me it's easier to start to respond to that question or those questions from an anecdotal perspective. And during my research for the book of Dear Machines, which was actually also questioning how do we measure intelligence and how do we categorize beings as intelligent, one of the discoveries was that actually intelligence from a very early stage was, from a scientific point of view, measured through language, but it was specifically natural language, which is how it's described human language. And during also that research, I found a fantastic paper of just some researchers that were interested in the sonic frequencies that plants emit. And they found out that they were actually communicating. So they found out that at a level that we cannot really perceive, there's this sonic emissions that plants use to communicate to one another. And when they're in distress, the frequency goes higher. And when they're more in a symbiotic environment, they go lower. And for me, that was like a kind of an anecdote or a memory that came up when I was listening to all of your presentations. And as a way also to relate it to my own work and my interest in intelligence, and specifically machine intelligence, I think that for me, actually raising those questions through the lens of the machine actually opened up a world of other intelligences. So for me, it was actually my interest in algorithmic technologies or computational cognition actually allowed me to understand better how everything around us is intelligent in one way or another. And I guess that's in relation to this idea of landscape or body and where the limit is. I would say that at least in this point of the research is a very long-winded relation to Spinoza, which is Spinoza is this philosopher, and he was speaking more about bodies as a way to describe objects or subjects that have the capacity to affect and be affected. And in that sense, then you could consider a body as everything that has that quality or that capacity. And that extends to territories, to landscapes, to but also situations. And I think that for me, using that philosophical lens also allows me to link my research to theories of affect, but also of somatic practices, which I think in a way is an attempt to define a method or a lens to what a decolonial or anti-colonial, I would position it more as an anti-colonial perspective for algorithmic technologies is, which is already quite, as I found out, quite a difficult question to start the research with. But that forced me to develop this lens or this methodology, because otherwise I couldn't even start to address the subject. But yeah, I hope that was not a very long-winded way of answering two questions.
Maybe there are questions already in the audience.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm wondering, and this is quite open-ended, if you think that humans demand labor from plants, and if so, what kind of labor do plants perform for humans?
That was a question to whoever. Yes. So it's open, whoever wants.
Maybe I can give it a try. I don't think that humans per se demand plants to perform labor, but I think that labor is a condition of the system that we found ourselves in, specifically in the context of capitalism. But I don't think that it's the human condition per se, but a consequence of inhabiting this condition of capitalism.
But sorry to, I'm not throwing you in, Felipe, but I'm just curious. I thought that perhaps your question in a way resonates with things you were engaging with in your description of all the work that already, for example, in indigenous populations, they already attribute to plants. So is there maybe an aspect that maybe you want to answer from that perspective?
I mean, I think it's I like the openness of the question, because there are many entry points. Do humans demand labor from plants? Is that right? I mean, first of all, not all humans are the same, and not all demands are equal. But I think we're caught in a sort of feedback loop where, for example, there is so much of a perception of plants should perform ecosystem services. The idea that our imaginary in some parts of the world is the Amazon is just a sea of green, and we perceive the Amazon as this resource, oxygen, tank, this belongs of the world. But when we start perceiving that this landscape is changing its vocation by a human intervention, such as alluvial gold mining, the concept is basically you have to remove everything and the surface, remove the plants, remove the centuries of plant forest debris in order to access the sand that is beneath. And you realize that we're demanding that plants are also vacated from the landscape, so they become obstacles. So I think it's from a more symbolic, but also there is an epistemic problem in this issue, which is our perception of plants as being subdued to human needs, either providing oxygen and livable environments and nourishment and nutrition, or being the obstacle, like the yerba mala, the weed, the thing we need to remove. So in that sense, I think it, it's a tricky question, because I can say, those are demands, but what are the other side of these demands, which is, for example, when you see indigenous movements, and by no means I want to, I represent their struggle, but I've been walking with various indigenous land defenders, leaders, who find in plants that source of energy that energizes social movements, but is pretty much, it's in the defense of life cycles, and plants play a huge role in those life cycles. Right? So the Amazon, for example, is perceived in agroecological terms as a complex, difficult place to grow food. But yet there is so much food that is being grown in the Amazon, yucca, potato, blah, blah, blah. So many crops that can be grown there if done in alignment with its own dynamics. So, you know, you don't have to use a lot of pesticides if you just allow certain plants to grow next to the other, and you kind of, so in that sense, is a demand to continue life. So what is the demand that plants pose on us?
Hi, thank you so much. My question is about kind of plant blindness in the kind of urban scape, especially kind of positioning this relationality with the plants and trying to position that to places where connection with plants is very controlled through what kind of industry you, or like what kind of city planning you access them by. And I'm wondering what do you think about kind of positioning plant blindness as a kind of de-intelligence or like regression of intelligence or of some sort that we are currently experiencing? Because I'm also thinking about, like, you're talking about how the plant in the tea is present with us, and then I'm thinking about all the plants I've eaten today or my whole life, and those plants that have been grown in monoculture, which have been devoid of their own like locality, their experience. To me, that I find that's very jarring somehow. And this is a semi-question. I just wanted to talk about this sort of, like the question of monoculture and also our relationality, like you are what you eat kind of thing, right? Like what kind of consciousness is then in the, like we are making the plant endure, and then what are we kind of ingesting or, yeah.
Should I offer an answer, but probably everyone has something to contribute. So, I mean, what can I say? It's a very, I think you're very sharp on that comment. There is a lot of plant blindness. I mean, first, I think this expression maybe comes from that sense that like we are, you know, we evolved in a way that we tend to not get distracted when we walk in a forest by all the shades of green. Because if we were to pay attention to every variety of plant that one encounters, then our attention, our senses would be totally overwhelmed. You know, it's another way to say, like, we can spot the apple because we're ignoring the variety of greens that are around the apple. So I think in that sense, maybe that plant blindness it's a kind of twofold problem, because we tend to generalize plants as well. So here is maybe a provocation. It's a plant, what sprouts out, or is a plant a body of plants that are growing next to one another? You know, we know that there is a lot of rhizomatic exchanges, and I mean, talking, for example, with plant sciences, the question was again: is a plant a collection of trees, or is a plant even singular, knowing that there are so many cells that make the whole of it? Maybe a plant is an assembly. So I think it's like, you know, these definitions are quite broad, but again, I think the challenge is, I think, is ontological, is very philosophical here, because it's how we engage, and it's also cultural, from our positionality with that subject or that entity. So I think what I'm more concerned about is that, for example, like we attribute powers to artificial intelligence almost in an animistic way. But we don't believe, and we're very, in this side of the world, we're very cautious and kind of tend to render more the belief on plants as spirits or as teachers or as subjects of knowledge or entities that have a knowing. We tend to render those ideas as esoteric, you know, cast a shadow of mysticism that we're not interested in engaging with. But many ancestral communities across the world, and probably also in Europe, live in contact with that part of a plant, you know, the spiritual, the symbolic, the semiotic, that means something else. So I guess what I want to say is also that, yeah, I think that plant blindness is very much context specific, but it's also cultural, but it's also not just to the green, but to its capacities. I just want to say, I think to be extra clear for me, what I want to say is plant, like intelligence is articulation, so it's thinking with. So I'm very much a believer that we can, it's a bit of a mental gymnastics, but we can start, bringing back a little bit of animism and bringing a little bit of a openness to our thinking. And again, think of, or consider a thinking with the plants that we are in contact with. The salad that you ate today, it's in your system. So in indigenous communities in the Colombian and Peruvian Amazon, and it's a very common practice in shamanic medicine, which is the first thing you do is you purge, you empty, you vomit, or you number two, a lot of it. So you empty your stomach, because the idea is that clear mind, clear body, clear thinking. So I'm an advocate of this type of thinking that starts from an emptying,
Okay, I think my question builds on the last ones. I wanted to return to something that you said, Felipe, during your talk about reciprocity and asking for permission to use a plant. And I wonder also in the context of the labor that I do believe that plants are expected to perform for us. Is this idea of asking permission reconcilable with the kind of capitalist world we live in? Just today I went to spend some time with some tree roots that I'm quite obsessed with that can be seen at low tide regularly on an island in the River Maas here. And they're most incredible root formations, which are visually stunning. And I discovered that there's been an operation of covering them up with stones. And that sort of part of the riverbank was already covered, and I was very shocked. And then a boat arrived, and I was able to actually film them covering up the rest of the roots all along the riverbank. And in doing this with this enormous crane and this sort of claw that came down and took rocks off of the boat and put them on the beach area and covered these parts of the trees. They, of course, broke off pieces of tree, and the tree got stuck in the claw, and it was really a drama. But when you were talking about permission and reciprocity, I was asking myself, yeah, where are we with this? And because these trees are crucial for holding up the riverbank. They are laboring for us. They are lined up. They're like soldiers. I don't know if you know the landscape of the Netherlands, but it's very, very regimented in order to keep the land where it is. It's existential. We need the plants to hold us here.
Well, I mean, definitely. I'm just trying to imagine. I'm sure it's quite moving to be there in that moment, and it's also really difficult to articulate because I'm going to return to what I said: mental gymnastics, or in Latin America we talk about feeling thinking. Like it's somewhere in between, like how we thinking happens. It's these acts of permission asking are a way to position ourselves against something and recognize, I don't want to say a personhood, but some kind of entity, like plants as subjects of rights, for example. And I think there are many, many interesting examples happening. I can say that, for example, Switzerland, I live in Switzerland, and I've been reading Florian Köchling, who for 30 or plus years has been an advocate for the right of plants. So I became very surprised when I found out that Switzerland is one of the few countries in the world that includes plants in their constitution, and is the dignity of plants. Treat plants in a dignifying way because of their life. Their life makes them entities worth of some kind of dignifying treatment. And I'm like, oh, that's so great. But it's the same country that has pharma industry that is doing a lot of biopiracy in parts of the world. And you're like, so can it, I don't know what it is. So I think it's a how do we align just ideas, but also sensibilities towards a common cause. No? It's not like speaking with a spiritual leader in one of my interviews. I was quite moved because I was saying like, hey, but I live in Switzerland, and then what can I do? And this person was like, I mean, plants are equal no matter where you go. They are all living entities. You know, these roots are not just connecting. They're not just to keep the plants grounded. They're basically connecting pathways. And I was just thinking, like, their life cycle is the same. The species might be different. What they do in the world is different, but their presence has the same role. You know, they play an active role in nature. So, in that sense, I'm just saying, okay, how can we build a bridge between these ideas? So, I think in that sense is for us to do the task. It's for us to change the terminology. It's for us to really do whatever is needed to create a bridge. So I talk about it as interepistemic research or attempts at bridging, but I think it's just something to consider here, and how, to what extent are we just complicit? And
I mean, I think there's something that comes in your work, that a lot of accepting from our perspective, where we're used to this kind of other notions of the agency of plants, is extremely difficult. And I think that's the point where we are challenged to realize that what you're saying, can we imagine some alternative? It's really extremely challenging work, because we need to, it's not only about saying, oh, they are, somebody out there is responsible, but it's like a way of thinking that we need to reconstitute. So, I mean, maybe I would like to bring this into a question, and maybe I'm curious, Rock, because in what you develop, you are emphasizing this question, which is thinking about listening with plants requires a very big recalibration, because it's not about attending in our subjective way to a particular sound as a kind of phenomena that we know how to hear, but it's actually to understand how the listening happens in very different configurations, in which we need to understand a whole, for example, massive constellation of interactions between plants, which we cannot simply say, okay, it's an ear. And I'm comparing this to what we're saying now. Is it enough with saying, oh, we need to be more careful? Yeah, but is that enough? Or is it that we really need to change the whole understanding of what does it mean to be careful, perhaps? And maybe that's where an alternative can very slowly be developed. I don't know. I'm curious if, Rock, you want to say something on this.
Yeah, maybe in that regard, there's like two sides of it. One that relates with we could call the sonorous domain of plants, which has to do, how, as you say, like how do we listen to this kind of sounds? Because, well, first of all, it's already kind of a methodological challenge in a way. It escapes our ears because they are too quiet, or sometimes in the ultrasonic domain and so on. So first of all, like something, as I mentioned, like there's like a necessary sort of reconfiguration of your practice, no? In that sense, like when you are paying attention to plants, you are into this kind of, I think of it as like you start being part of this sensing compound, where you are starting to pay attention to maybe specific registers that you're somehow not attuned. And for that, of course, there's like a necessary like technological mediation, which is part of it, and so on. And the other side of this question has to do with listening, and how do we understand listening. And for that, when I started like researching in the kind of canonical listening modes literature, or also like just listening methodologies. I find very often that the way the idea of a listening mode is posed is perhaps not so useful, and in order to understand like plants, audible world, we could say, and also I take this as sort of like opportunity to develop from this. We could call it a point of view, but it's a point of view without a subject, but that you somehow, start thinking about, perhaps this act of attention is not so much about this prefigured subject that is attending one directionally to this auditory phenomena, but you start maybe thinking, actually maybe intentionality, first of all, is much more reciprocal. And second, it maybe even escapes like the experiential scale, no? So it might also have to do with a kind of deep time commitment with your environment and so on, because it's not that plants can choose to listen to the sounds of moving water, which is something that has been investigated recently, as a kind of switch in the same way we can do, right? As in like, I'm gonna pay attention to this aspect of sound, but it somehow implies a kind of prior decision, the fact that they are attuned to this sensory register. And here I think, it's important to start considering maybe other scales of that don't necessarily have to do with like the immediate experience of a sound, and which I find like something very revealing, something that I can say I've learned with them. These are my thoughts on it.
Is there maybe a final question? Somebody? There's one more question, and we'll need to wrap up. Sorry. Yes, please. Sorry, I interrupted.
If there's time, I just had a thought or a response to what you were commenting on, and it made me think as well of like how we could develop this framework for relating differently to plants. And to me, I think is deeply related to the way we refer to ourselves in relation to the plants. Sorry to repeat the word several times, but I think that it is kind of like this mind trap that if we talk about this relationship in terms of labor, then immediately we're putting it in this framework of like capitalism because they're working for us. Whereas if we look at it from the context of care, then you could see it as a relationship. And then if you think about that situation as a relationship, like with the tree in the riverbank or the plant in the forest, I think that immediately your position within the relationship shifts, because it is not you who is demanding something from it, but it is actually a situation where you need to actually wonder, like, what is that you're giving and what is it that you're receiving in return. And I think that that is something that communities, like indigenous communities, but also other non-Western cultures actually know about. And I think that knowing is a long-term project. And in that sense, I could say, or I think that for me, that long-term project is a process of not decolonizing, but actually opposing the coloniality of the thought that has been inscribed in our societies.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, thanks a lot. It's been a while since I've seen art research projects, so it's refreshing to see what's happening in the field. This is a very difficult question, so get ready, and hopefully it will lead us to another dimension of encounter, maybe outside this room. It's about anthropomorphism, right? And we all struggle with it when we're encountering nature. And if we take like Haraway Margulis symbiogenesis theory, that the reason that plants' medicines work on us is because we emerged with the plants over millions of years together, right? So actually we're not separate from the plants, right? So drawing the line between us and the plants is, in the first place, like a cultural act. It's a kind of Yeah, and even in your film, Felipe, you had I don't know if it was a shaman, but the person who knew the plants, he had to know the plants in his body, but when the plant spoke to him, it came in the shape of a human. So it's very hard to get away from, I mean, and when we're dealing with like intelligence, or agency, these are metaphors that we use for plants. I mean, these are human concepts, right? So it's very difficult for us as humans to connect, or get out of, I mean, actually, we're also plants, right? We have plenty of plant matter inside us, right? So in the end, I would put it to you, would you say, and it's to all of you because I think it relates to all of your practices, our practices are social with plants. And the problem, if there's a political one, is something that we need to deal with between humans.
I mean, I'm sure everyone has something to add. But I mean, I really appreciate your comment and a question. I'm not exactly sure if there was a question, but really, I think, if I could, sometimes I have gone through the exercise, which is still trapped in my mind, to think, what would plants think of me? And what are they saying now about us? And of course, it's just like this feedback loop into, we can always assume or we can always project. But ultimately, as again, my friend Ayenan Quinchoa, who you saw, he's the protagonist of the film once, we were just walking, hiking. Actually, he was here in Europe during the filming, and he just said, hey, look, we are the ones who are stressing and preoccupied and spending energy on these debates because plants, lucky for them, they learn how to conserve energy. They learned how to minimize these frictions to put that energy to something else. For example, to metabolize in ways that they are capable of sustaining themselves and us. Without them, we cannot exist. Without us, they can flourish and whatever. So I think back to your point, I think it's to not just stay on the trap, but just really acknowledge that if there is anything in my case that I am trying to do is to play in this complex political kind of relation, not with plants, but with people, with context. And of course, I think there is a reason why I'm here speaking. There is a reason why this research is here. There is a reason why, for example, I accepted to participate in a project funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation around these ideas, because I think there's work to do here, particularly in the context where I live, because this is where we need to come up to a debate. And I do think that it's not only for indigenous communities, but there are a lot of plant alliances happening all around the world. And I'm sure in this city there are gardeners or there are people aligned with the priorities, the shared priorities of the plant or the vegetal communities that live, coexist, co-create these spaces. So I want to acknowledge that. And that I want to also say, it's not the work I'm interested in. It's not only about portraying indigenous communities as unique in that. No, there is a lot going on. And every day I learn more about collectives, movements, and just super interesting people doing things. But I find their work quite political in that sense. It's about changing these relationships that we are the ones who ultimately need to do the work.
Thank you for your question. I really enjoy your question because has been my struggle in my mind also for the past few years. This, kind of almost like a trap we cannot escape from. This, impulse to grab on this notion of anthropomorphosis, and that's also part of the reason why I am also being a little bit skeptical towards the idea of the essentialist idea of the indigenous knowledge. I mean, maybe alternative knowledge system, like by default. So I can share a little story with you from my own cultural background. So in the 1800s, the 1700s, in China, people in that time, before the lineage system was developed, people will also name the trees, but in different kind of ways and formats. There was a book called A Register of Pines and Stones in a Particular Mountain. Okay, so what the function this book does is it emphasizes on the value of beholding things, like seeing things, for the pure joy of appreciation. And but still within that book, you can see people's own ways. They're finding their own way to describe nature and to name those different trees under anthropomorphosis ideas. One distinct example is that one tree is being named called greeting pine, and that's now remotely the national symbol of China. And the reason why it's being called a greeting pine because the tree has two sub-branches, almost like hugging people from approaching to beholding it. And what I'm trying to say is that this is my second fault critique, but I think there is a layer of danger of being overtly romanticizing the other. But I also feel like whenever I imagine this, thought of this case of this different way of naming, it also reminds me of a different way of relationships that outside of the framework of labor, and it can be just as simple as purely seeing something and appreciating that and become inspiration. And overall, the need for seeing is actually mainly still going back human centric, because we do have eyeballs and most of the plants does not. So I like still to land on the notion of scales and to be open and attentive to the differences of different systems. And I think I would like to end with the historical fact in my research, which is also, you mentioned a little bit about the notion of tree as static, like not moving, but they're actually moving all the time. So during the last glacial maximum, which is about 20,000 years ago, the sea level was much lower, like about 150 meters or so below current sea level. So there were actually land bridges connecting different parts of East Asia, in between Okinawa, Ryukyu Island chain and Taiwan, and the mainland is the entire East Sea. So thus, the tree can grow and migrate, and birds can fly and propagate through feces. And I think, and oftentimes plants live and surpasses human civilization scales. I think that is the openness I would love to advocate for all of us. I think to try to think beyond. I think that's at least a small gesture we can all try to do. Thank you.
I think we can close on that. Thank you.